Okay, awesome. Well, welcome to the Business Podcast Mastermind. I'm Ethan Janney, and we give you a little description of what we're doing here. We're live on Facebook and YouTube at the moment. So if you're watching, I'll check for any questions, comments you have. This is a business podcast mastermind that was started with a few talented friends in the business podcasting space who expanded it to create a weekly event where a wider audience could join. I'll tell you a little bit about each of the folks you see here. Rob Greenlee, he is the VP of Content and Partnerships at Libsyn. He's the chair of the Podcast Academy, a well-known evangelist of the podcasting industry, and co-host of the new media show audio and video podcast that airs live on Saturdays and Wednesdays, among other great things. And Henry Lopez may join us in a little bit. He's a serial entrepreneur. Oh, sorry, that's Vinay.
I'm here.
Henry's here. Henry Lopez is here. He's a serial entrepreneur, small business coach, and host of the top-rated How of Business podcast. A prolific small businessman since purchasing his first business in 1991. He's dedicated to helping others start, run, and grow their small businesses. Vinay is the one who may show up in a bit. He's the host of the Predictable B2B podcast and founder of Sproutworth. He provides content creation, content marketing, and blog management solutions, and helps business owners, marketing and sales executives achieve predictable growth by expanding their influence. And I'm Ethan Janney, co-host of the Run With It podcast. We invite 7+ figure entrepreneurs to share business ideas and the action steps to launch them. I also coach people through ambitious career moves, and I coach founding teams towards Fortune 500 dreams. And on today's show, what we're going to do is we're going to review what we went over last week with our guest, Margie Feldhune. Yeah. You did an excellent job of pronouncing your name, Henry. We talked about growing your podcast by guesting on other podcasts. And basically what we're doing today is we're following up on some of the actions that we suggested from last week, which was to go and find 10 podcasts that may be a good fit for you for guesting. Think about one of them, especially as just in its own right, a great networking opportunity with the other hosts, no matter what you might get in terms of exposure. And then working on developing your one sheet that you can share with people, and so they know more about having you as a guest on their podcast, or alternatively developing that kind of thing on your website. And today, what we're just going to do is, there's no obligation to have completed those tasks, but we can follow up if somebody's working on those things. We can help, we can answer questions. We can talk a little bit more about guesting in general and the various folks' experiences and suggestions with guesting. Give you a little more background on Henry. I mean, his podcasts are up to 40,000 downloads. What is it per?
My last 3-month average is 50,000 downloads monthly.
Excellent. Very good. So he's got experience in growing a podcast and gaining an audience, but he's also been on plenty of shows, and that's been part of his strategy. And then, of course, Rob, we heard about him, but he's also been in the podcasting space, since the word podcast was invented. He's really been obsessed with the industry of media, of new media, in and out of, popularity and falling out of popularity. So he's got a lot of experience. I'm sure he's been on tons of shows and has a lot of advice about how to be a good guest and how to get the most out of it. So with the people that are here, I see Mo just joined. Welcome, Mo. We can really focus on who's here and talk to folks. Before we move on to speaking with individual people in the audience, Henry or Rob, well, let's start with Henry. Did you have anything to add or want to add just to set us up?
No, I think that's all great. As you were talking, I was just looking through my notes, trying to think of what was one thing that I took away from the conversation with Margie last week. And, everything that she said was really about reinforcement from my perspective and my experience. So I'll keep giving that some thought, though. It's always good, even if you've done it for a while, to get that validation from an expert like her that maybe you're going about it the right way. So that's what I was thinking about while you were going through the intro. And then, as I mentioned at the outset, and perhaps if we have time, we can go around to us and kind of share some additional thoughts on how we're each doing it as far as outreach goes to get on other shows.
Yeah, and I can also, if we want, we can, since we can vote here if we want, but I can overview a little bit of last week's content if that feels useful to folks on the call. But yeah, Rob, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just, as you're thinking about being a guest on a podcast or whatever, just put yourself in the other show's shoes, right? As you think about approaching them and what their priorities are. I think it's helpful being a podcast host when you're formulating an approach to another podcaster, right? Because you can kind of understand where they're coming from. They're going to look at a guest as something that's going to be additive to their show. Now, granted, some podcasts are going to look at you and they're going to look to you to kind of like lead the show. But then there's other podcasts that are going to want to have you contribute to a conversation. So that's a little different dynamic, and those kind of guests need to be very clear on why they're there and what they're doing. And those that are looking for someone to kind of like almost like lead the show. Now, some people think of doing an interview as like, well, the focus is the guest, right? So there's kind of two ways of looking at it. And I think that's what we talked about last week to some degree, is that I think for a lot of podcasters, the host is really the most important aspect, and the guest is kind of secondary. So going into that situation with that in mind, right? How can you add value to a podcast and think about your skills, your background, the stories that you can tell that maybe can add to the depth of knowledge that is trying to be presented in that podcast might be helpful in you landing those opportunities.
Yeah, and just to
go ahead.
I'm sorry, just to piggyback on that. I think that the approach, when I look at the guests that have been the best guests on my show, are the ones that take the approach of wanting to share knowledge first and foremost before any kind of selling whatever it is that they're selling, right?
Right.
And I think if we think about that's the approach that you see for people who do it well online, period, to establish themselves as an authority, give away, share all kinds of value before they say, hey, go buy my book or go sign up for my course. And so I think that's what I try to do, is make sure that when I go on a show, I'm giving more value than might be expected in return for whatever plug I might get or whatever mention I might make of a landing page. And I think if you do that, you're going to be a pretty good guest on someone else's show.
Yeah, I'll just, what I was going to mention, following up also on what Rob was saying, the thing that we came up with that was interesting about making the host the kind of centerpiece of what's going on. It's that the host represents an audience. They have their listeners, and their listeners listen to them for their perspective on things. And so when you're a guest on the show, yes, you're the focus of that episode, but people they're coming back to this podcast because they like this podcast, and they like the way things are framed. They like the personality of the host. So you want to think about, if you're going to change your message at all and make it not a generic message, how is it a message that you're sort of using the host as like a mouthpiece to communicate with their audience? And you really want to pay attention to, what they care about, what their audience cares about, and the perspective that they take. I thought that was really useful. Because I mean, of course, I maybe intuitively thought, of course, I want to make the host look good when I'm guesting on podcasts, but thinking of them as a special, almost like a translator, between different types of people. I think that's really helpful. And also to think of myself that way as a podcaster.
Yeah, and the host has to really listen too, because what you want to create is a conversation with your guests, not a monologue on the part of the guest, right? So that's how you as a host, you're there to extract value out of that guest, right? And present that, make sure that your audience finds those nuggets that as a host and who your audience is looking for, right? So you're like the curator of the content coming out of your guest. And I think that's where the value is.
I think we need to do a session on just that topic, guys, because I think that's such a critical point. And it's so hard to do because, not to go off on a tangent here, but Rob, the challenge is you're also playing director at the same time that you're trying to listen intently. And that is a skill that takes time to develop. So I really think we should come back and visit this on another session. What do we call it? These sessions, episodes? I'm confused as to what to call these.
I don't know. We're just getting started. We can
I know.
see
I'm calling them sessions because episodes, I think I'm on a podcast. So
yeah, episode is weird. Yeah, I said that.
Yeah, it's weird. So the next one session, we need to do a deep dive on that because that is such a critical skill to becoming an effective podcaster, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. Appreciate that perspective. In terms of other things to go over from the conversation last week on that topic, another thing that I love that came up was this, just a simple tip, right? Of the way that you think about your audience and how you're talking to them. A host talking to their audience on a very personal level, meaning this idea came up, if you say, everyone out there in my audience, this is for you, I love you all. Like it's actually depersonalizing to the individual.
Out to the How Business Nation. That whole
right.
nation thing, right?
It's very radio on that way.
Very radio, yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So, the idea of, and I had gotten this tip previously, and maybe some of our guests here have gotten that as well. But when you're talking to the person listening, we say now, it's a little bit awkward, but we say, to the person listening, right? Not to the people listening, but to the person listening. And always try to imagine that you're kind of whispering in someone's ear, right? And and
well, you are.
If yes, you are. I mean, yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So I thought that was another gem that came out just as a way to think. It's a very, very personal. It's just emerging how personal the podcasting space is, and having this association with radio, and what we've seen in other broadcasting medium. There's this tendency to kind of think more in terms of, the big audience of faceless individuals, but it's useful to think about it on a smaller scale. That was also one of our participants last week. She was saying, I thought that was really great. She was saying she was afraid that her podcast is going to grow too big. And I remember Rob saying, oh, this is perfect. Don't worry. You've got this small kind of cozy vibe to what you do. You just keep doing what you're doing. And who knows, it may grow very big, but you won't have to give up that personal touch. That's exactly what will help you grow.
Well, and the honest truth is, when you start a podcast, really, actually, nobody is listening.
Nobody's listening.
So you need to, you can kind of grow into that, right? It's not like when you do a podcast, you have to worry about a million people hearing what you say. It's, you may have a couple. So, and you just kind of get better and better and better, and your audience grows. So, yeah.
I'm going to ask Rob. I want to ask Henry. Also could ask Rob this, but Henry, do you remember the transition between having a handful of people, to now you had, 100 downloads, and then you had 1,000? Do you remember what that looked like? Is there something that were you engaging heavily with the, 10 to 12 people that you started with, or how did that look when you were starting to grow?
Yeah, I've been asked this question a lot, even of myself. I can't pinpoint it to one thing. I do know when 2 summers ago now, it dramatically hockey sticked up, but I cannot attribute it to any one thing. So what I believe is it was a cumulative effect of things that finally got traction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only thing I can point it on. Otherwise, I'd be lying to you. So it's, and some of us came back. We talked about it last week a little bit. Margie was talking about how they pick I forget what she called it, the middle section of shows, not the shows that had just gotten started, because they might pod fade, and maybe not, the ones that want you to pay to be on their show. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just as a result. I just talked to a person who called yesterday for a free coaching session. That's one of my call to actions. And I always ask, how did you find me? And then 9 times out of 10, they'll say the podcast, and then I'll ask a few more questions. How did you find a podcast? If they remember. One of the things this guy said, which I think highlights the answer here to an extent, is I looked for business shows, and yours seemed to be the one that had been around a long enough time and had a lot of episodes, and I liked what you were saying. And so I think it's just been a cumulative effect over time, that consistency, at least one episode a week for over 4 years now, and sticking to my genre. So what I was trying to do, I think the cumulative effect is what you're seeing. I have to believe that a big part of it was having guests on primarily just about every show, and that network effect of them sharing it with their audience. I have to believe that's been a big part of it.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, we saw like a bit of a jump in our listenership, which we couldn't explain, a couple months ago too. It's like, oh, because actually it went down a little bit due to the quarantine.
Right in March, I had a drop. Remember, you and I talked about it, and then it's been going up to record months ever since. And I'm also, if I look at how many people are scheduling calls and how many inbound opportunities for coaching clients, this has been, again, one of those pivotal events where people are like, maybe I should not look for another one of these corporate jobs, right? So that definitely has been going on. Now, there were some movers. There's a gentleman by the name of Joe Apfelbaum, who's a marketing guy out of New York. And I had him on my show, and he's got a mailing list. I think at the time he had told me it was like 50,000 people. And let me tell you, I saw a dramatic jump on that one episode. Now, I didn't keep all of that, understandably, but that's one guy that I had on my show that I would have never known, right? He's quite the character, and he was a good interview, but his followers will take action. And so that was one-off bump. But again, that was a one-off that I didn't necessarily maintain. I think it's been a cumulative effect. But the keys are consistency, right? Consistency. That's the hard part. I think isn't that the hard part to anything?
Well, you have to be there to succeed, right?
Exactly. You got to show up on a consistent basis, and people start finding you. But that's hard to do because 4 years is a long time of producing a weekly show. Yeah.
Nobody said it was easy.
Wax on, wax off.
Exactly. Nobody said it was easy.
Yeah, and it's likely not going to happen overnight. So it's the stick-to-itiveness of it, and it's the refinement and the improvement that you make to your show. Right. And there's going to be these lucky breaks that happen, just like what you said. Right. I mean, if I think back to the nationally syndicated radio show I had for many years, there were always like these lucky things that happened, but they happened because I was there doing something interesting to people, right? Those lucky breaks just don't happen to you just because you start a show. They happen because you're adding value to people. And like I had a listing in PC Magazine early on, with my show saying this is the best web show on technology. Those things you don't even know sometimes when these things happen, right? Or a feature that happens in Apple or in Spotify because you had a great guest or something like that. So sometimes those things just happen organically, and you're looking at your stats and you go, why did this episode go through the roof?
I know.
And sometimes it's hard to find out why, but like the largest, and I don't know if this really means anything, but the largest play and download the experience that I had with my radio show, because I had it available online during like 99, 2000, 2001. I was on a lot of streaming platforms back then too with my radio show. The number one day for me on my show, it just went through the roof, was the attack on 9/11. So it's like, really?
Interesting.
What I didn't talk about 9/11 stuff on the show, but what it shows you is that you have to be there, and you have to be doing consistent things, and you have to build reliability, and good things will happen.
Yeah, you stumble on luck, and then
I think
I think you make a good point. I've always looked at it as you got to become a student of the art of it, and that never ends. You're always learning. Hence how we came together in part, right? So you have to become a student of this thing that you want to do well. And it takes practice, but it also takes learning from others and taking those observations to heart and changing and adjusting and looking at how you can get better. That's a constant thing. But being there and just doing it consistently. And I'll tell you, early on in the first couple of years, certainly when it wasn't providing any monetary measurable value, the reason I kept doing it is because I enjoy doing it. I have met so many people. I have connected with so many people, again, present company included, and I love doing it. So that's what has carried me through it as much as anything else.
Passion. That's what it's all about.
I got a question here from Deb, and she said, what are the key factors for a guest that yields an impact to the podcast? I've heard followers of the guest. I've heard going from C to B to A level guest, but she just wants great conversation and listener value. What do you think?
So I'll go first. I've said this before, Deb, maybe you hadn't heard it. To me, the number one criteria there's two things I look at immediately when I receive a pitch. One is it a fit? And not just is it a fit for my podcast, but is it a topic that makes sense? I haven't talked about it in the last few months. It's something I maybe haven't talked about at all. So that's first. But second, and what will override that is, after I vet you a little bit, do I think I want to have a conversation with you? Do I think I will enjoy the conversation? And there's no specific thing. I'll listen to them on other shows. That's a must. Do I think this is someone I would enjoy talking to? Period. Right. And if I don't feel that, I rarely will move forward. And those are my two top criteria.
Right. I'd say that the number one for me is just sheer plain curiosity. That's the number one thing. And it has to map to what I'm trying to do with my goals of my show around topics, but just genuine curiosity and fascination and wonderment with what this person is doing and what they represent and what they have to share. And I'll go listen to them in other media too, before I invite them or even accept them on the show, just to make sure that they're going to be able to bring it, right? And have an intelligent conversation about this, right, topic.
Yeah, that's such a great qualifier, Rob. Thanks for helping me think through this. But that's what when I say, do I want to have a conversation, is part of what Rob is saying. Is this topic something that interests me as well? And I agree with Rob on that. So do I think I like you enough to have a conversation? And the topic is something that I'm going to enjoy the conversation. It's not going to be like, oh, let me ask you about this. Let me ask you about this.
Low energy.
If I'm not excited about the topic and the person, then I'm fortunate at this point that I can say no.
Right.
We actually had someone on our podcast recently that probably wasn't a good fit. It was a little bit of a stretch. But
let me ask you, did you suspect it? Did you suspect that ahead of time or not? Because I've had that happen where I thought it was going to be great and it doesn't go so great, right?
So it was a toss-up. I mean, he was close, but he just wasn't there. We released the episode and I listened back to it and I said, we didn't really even have to release this one. I mean, I think it was almost entertaining that he was not a good guest. Maybe there's something entertaining about how he was kind of an idiot, but yeah, so just another vote in that this is what this is all about, and it's probably going to come out in the quality of the episode too. You should just have somebody that you care about that connection. And when I'm realizing this is very interesting, a couple of things. I'm a very cross-domain person, so I see how patterns go into different domains. The first one I'll mention is going back to this, having it be a sum of a bunch of different things happening at the same time, right? The podcast growth. In another life, I've tuned pianos and I've regulated the actions of pianos, and it's the same thing. And I talk to other piano technicians. There's no one thing that's going to make it sound good. It's tweaking this part, and you tweak this part, and you tweak this part. And then all of a sudden, now that you've touched everything and you've tweaked everything a little bit, there's some sort of a sum total effect where then there starts to be some synergy. So I can see a pattern that happens at different places, and it's hard to know that's going to happen because you keep tweaking this. You go, well, you're never going to get there. And you tweak that, oh, it's not there yet. It's not going to get there. And then all of a sudden it almost just happens. And you go, oh, so all of that all those little tweaks, there was a sum of them. Very interesting perspective.
It's more of an art, obviously, than a science.
I wanted
Yeah.
to answer one part of the question that Deborah asked too, is around followers. And I know that some podcasts, I used to work for Podcast One, who had a lot of celebrities on there, and they were trying to game this thing of, well, this celebrity has 100,000, followers to his Twitter account. Does that qualify him to either be a host of a new show or a guest of a show? And my comment to that is, there is very little mapping between followers on social media and success as a guest or a host in a podcast, because it's about the content, not about how many people clicked a like button. So because a lot of those people that click those follow buttons aren't connecting with you at that level anyway. So it's too easy. So going to that next level of subscribing and listening to a podcast is a lot more commitment than a follow. So that would be my comment on that.
I can say I have, this is a smaller sample size. We've been doing this for about a year, but I've noticed that of the episodes of ours that have the most downloads, they tend to be also folks who are relatively active on social media. And that could just be a symptom of, they also care, they care to share and promote when they do something they want in this podcast. They make a post about it, they talk about it, things like that. But it seems like, and there's some people, through no fault of their own, really, they're just not, they're not spreading the word about anything, really. They're just interesting people, great interviews, great content, but they're not necessarily getting a ton of downloads at this point in our growth, because there's just less people hear about it. It's just a math thing, I think. So I got another comment here from Deb here.
Yeah.
Building brand built on passion for podcasting is important, but what is the point of relevance that indicates some monetization of the podcast itself versus generating other business development, i.e. her consulting business? Just some key indicators. So when does it make sense to monetize? When does it not make sense to monetize? Focus on something like your consulting.
Well, it depends on what you're trying to do when you say monetize, because there's various options on that side that may map to what you're doing on the business side, right? So it just depends, it depends also how big your audience is too, because the advertising side isn't typically much of an option for small shows. So you typically, if you want to monetize and you have a fairly small show, then focusing on other aspects, right? So it becomes more about who's listening to your podcast versus how many people are listening to your podcast. So if it's being used as a brand building, personal development, career development, offering trainings, workshops, to support that kind of business, then it's about who's listening, not about how many are listening. So that would be my comment on that.
Yeah, I will just make a comment about monetization aside from advertising. We haven't actually tried any of that, but I do have it's like a pseudo podcast. I just started publishing as a podcast, not as active as just doing like a weekly call. And the audience is about 50 to 100 people live every Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
And at first it was a free thing, but at some point I decided to test what the kind of marketability of it is. And this is an audience who's not making money right now because of quarantine. So it's a little bit of a touchy subject, but I did get a sort of a nominal $8 a month subscription thing going on. And with offering just a little bit of extra organizing the content and offering access to previous recordings and things like that. And I feel like it's a pseudo, hey, I love what this is and I want to support it. And yes, I'd like to make it easier to kind of join and participate. And, within a few months, there's already 50, 60 people signed up for that, so there can be this concept of sort of subscribership, and bonuses, especially if you're delivering something where you're really like, people are like, oh, this is my salvation. Thank you so much for this resource. And you don't have to have a huge audience, to just start bringing in some income.
Right.
And I think I've seen it change. 2 years ago, as I was first courting sponsors, inbound even, it was all about their metrics were still so much aligned with what radio is about. And so that was impossible to connect sometimes. I'm finding now that advertisers and the agencies that book them are now understand the podcast platform better. And so they're not asking for as much as that. We talked about it with the guest that we had a few episodes ago about LinkedIn as an example and their requirements and their demands. So I've seen that evolve, but to go to the high level again, and Deb, please, join us here in the conversation, because I want to make sure that we're addressing your question. I think I came into it with the realistic expectation that my podcast in and of itself wasn't going to make me rich, right? The podcast was one way that I was going to establishing myself as an authority on this topic of helping people start and grow a small business. And so I knew there was one vehicle. Some people write a book, some people have a podcast and a book, whatever. To me, that's what it was going to provide for me. This year has been interesting in that I thought because of COVID, my sponsorships would dry up. But in fact, as I've looked back at this year, I'm now booked through the end of 2020. And I'm starting to really think now, while I love that income because it more than offsets production, and that's always the way I looked at sponsorship, at times, though, I'm missing out on promoting my own services, my own offerings. And I heard that put best by a podcaster, and I've maybe heard it a couple of times, that really ideally is what you're eventually promoting. It should be, as you build an audience, a way to create that tribe of yours that then wants more from you. So that's the way I tend to look at it. Are we answering your question, Deb?
I might not have allowed her to unmute herself.
Oh, she's punished.
Go ahead and allow. Right.
She's in timeout.
Maybe that's also why she's only been typing her question.
Hey.
Yes, and then some, and I probably need a couple more hours with you guys. I'll probably book a call with you because I have so many questions, because I'm thinking about future and possibilities now, even though I'm still small, but I love the platform. So thank you so much. It was great.
Why did you start your podcast? What's your goal for your podcast? At least what you think it is now, because it's going to evolve.
It is, but it is so grounded in having a platform that I don't have to wait for anybody to share my own insights, my vision for my business and how I help people, and gaining insights from people that I didn't have growing up in corporate. So it's for the love of it, the love of the broadcasting, and the effects, the unanticipated effects of the network, to your point. But it also promotes my brand. It's an extension of my brand. And with time, I'm starting to see interest, which may convert. But I want to be able to know and plan ahead for when that interest turns into something, or when do I need to make a change because I have enough relevance.
Yeah. And the way you express it is the right way to look at it. From a marketing perspective, we know that we have to touch someone a number of times before they're going to buy, right? So the way I look at it is, what I'm doing is I'm building trust with this audience, and as they build that trust, then they'll be more than ready to take the next action that you want them to take. But it sounds to me like you've got, from my perspective, the right attitude. Another example of how I use my content is when I do have a coaching client. Very often we'll talk about a topic, and I'm fortunate I've got 300 episode catalog. I'll send them, I want you to listen to this episode and this episode and this episode. So I'll prescribe them an episode, and that's the way I use my back catalog in a way to kind of help them learn something or to make a point. So, but it seems like you've got the right approach. I think earlier days, and I'm sure it still happens, people thought, oh, I'm going to do one of these podcasts and become rich like John Lee Dumas, because look at his numbers. I can do that, right? I think the reality for most of us is that's not what it's about. I don't know what you guys think.
The one thing that I'll say after that is that it is, for me, I like to do things that have a value on multiple levels. And I think podcasting is one of those things that the people who realize it are getting a lot out of. You know, it's about networking, it's about amplifying your voice, it's about creating content. You know, one of Eben Pagan, who I've followed a little bit, he's great with marketing and he's been doing online business stuff for many years. One thing he says, if you want to make money, don't focus on making money, focus on creating value. And so if you're creating a show every week, you know, and you're getting better at it by default every week, you're creating value and it's out there. You know, you don't have to go show people that it's out there. It's just kind of sitting out there. So the more value you have sitting out there, the more opportunity you have, just the money can follow from that kind of situation. Rob, I saw you kind of grimace or something. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I say that a lot too. And I've heard a lot of people say that too around value, but where the rubber hits the road is what constitutes value, right?
Right.
And is the value the same for everyone, no matter what you do? And I would say no. So, and it's hard to customize content, even for podcasting, even though it's a very intimate medium, everybody's got different needs, right? So that's the difficult thread that a podcaster has to walk, is how do I make my content valuable to one person, right? And is that translatable across thousands of people? And my comment to that is that what you wind up doing is, when you create content that you've identified that's valuable to one person, what you have happen over time is there's a self-filtering process that happens to your show, where the people that don't get value out of it, they kind of drop off. And the people that are getting value tend to come in, because there's a word of mouth sharing that happens from the people that are getting the value from it. And there's an affinity connection with those people that have been getting value with other people that they connect with. So that's what you're trying to foster, is a word of mouth sharing. You can't, you know, and this is something that I wrestled with many years ago with my radio show, because my radio show was very much like a variety show. Now, granted, it was focused on technology, the growth and development of the internet, but I had a variety of topics on there. But what I found is that podcasting tends to splinter out based on niche. And so value tends to follow very niche topics. And then that attracts people to those niche topics that have interest. So like doing a podcast about Jeeps, right? It's a really good example. There's a passionate following for people that love Jeeps, and they want to learn, you know, the cutting edge on how to customize their Jeep, or how to do various things with their Jeep, or things they can do socially or whatever. So you can really niche that down, right, to drive value to that community. But some topic areas, it's not as clear cut as that, right? So, you know, that's how I like to look at it too, is that you have niche groups that you're trying to attract. And sometimes at the beginning of your podcast, you're probably not focused enough, and you're basically seeing people come in, listen to your show, and then drop out. So people aren't coming back every week, right? People, especially if you focus on guests, right? If you focus on topic driven guests and you're all over the map, then that audience isn't building a strong connection to you based on an affinity interest. And that's, I think, what happens over time with this podcast. And Henry, that's probably what happened to you too, is that you started your show and you started working your way through it, and you start getting your passion started to get more focused. And then you started to attract audiences that had that same passion interest.
Yeah.
And that's how you grew your show.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. And as you were talking, I'm thinking about it. About the 2-year mark, I did hit a wall thinking, okay, what is this doing for me?
Right.
I didn't think it was going to be something that would be a stream of income, but it was taking a tremendous amount of my time.
Right.
And so that's the thing that can happen to us as podcasters. So one of the things that happened, like you said, it was an opportunity for me to streamline it and be more selective about guests. But also I really reduced all of the work that I was doing with producing a show. You know, I got help producing it. And those things help me get over that hump of, all right, why am I doing this? And that's how I reinvigorated it for myself anyway.
And that's that focus that I'm talking about, drilling down into what's important to you. And over time, what you'll do is you'll self-filter your audience.
Yeah.
Right.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I've struggled with, right now, I am speaking to both the aspiring entrepreneur who's probably in the corporate world and wants to start their first business, and also the existing small business owner. And I'm juggling both. I've gone back and forth a lot as to whether I should focus on one or the other. I keep not being able to make that decision, but it's something that would probably help my show even further if I niched down to just people looking to start their first business. The reason I haven't done it is I enjoy working with both groups. That's the fact.
And the key to that is having a niche focus that has a big interest group.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
You can find those niches, which are sometimes pretty well populated with shows. That's the problem sometimes.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Henry, I'm curious how, because I've heard a lot about this in terms of marketing and creating any product or service, creating a client avatar that's very specific, maybe they even have a name and, number of kids or whatever. How specific have you gotten with that imaginary avatar? Do they have a name? What's been your process there?
Yeah, they did have a name. And by the way, when we first went into podcasting, we subscribed to John Lee Dumas's Podcaster's Paradise course. And it was very good for us. We learned a heck of a lot. It was very valuable, especially for the price point back then. And of course, that's part of his exercises, to define your avatar. Now, he believes it's Piggy's perfect question off of what we just talked about. He believes, as a lot of people do, you have one avatar in mind. I struggle with it, and I have too. But yes, I did do that exercise, and I have these two people in mind, and I've described them fairly detailed. And do I refer back to those avatars as often now? Probably not, because it's just naturally who I know I'm speaking to.
Right.
But yes, I did go through that, and I still think about it that way. But I have two people in mind, not one.
Cool. How about you, Rob? And I'm curious also, just from you having started in podcasting, since its inception, and I've had that idea been around when you were first starting, of having like that one listener, and if not, when did it come about, and has that been a part of your journey as a podcaster?
I would say when I started doing my radio show, I didn't have that idea at all. It was more trying to. I very much had an attitude that I was trying to reach a big audience, right? So it wasn't, I didn't have that orientation. I hadn't been around the medium and experienced it as much back then. But over time, it's just something that became very apparent to me. And as podcasting launched, it became even more apparent on those points. So yeah, it's, the concept of personas, which is something I've spent quite a bit of time involved in back even when I worked at the Xbox team at Microsoft for 6 years. We spent a lot of time in personas to come up with products and features and functions around who we thought our users would be, or our customers, right? So it's very similar, right? You come up with an idea of who your ideal listener is, or customer, can be the same, right? And you just walk through the process. What does that typical person think about? What is important to them? What is their orientation, their lifestyle orientation? Where are they spending their time? Are they listening to music? Are they on Facebook? Where are they? And then you come up with products and marketing that targets those people. And so that's, that can apply to podcasting too. Yeah.
Who's your person for the new media show? Just curious.
Podcasters, anybody that's typically that show is not necessarily for beginners. I would say it's for the professionals in the industry. whether it be executives that are running big media companies, to VPs, to salespeople, to people that are involved in the engineering side of podcasting. I mean, I think we try and target the industry of podcasting, not necessarily in individual small podcasters, because some of the topics that we talk about on that show are so far beyond the scope of what most new podcasters would even have a clue about. So that's who we typically go after, is industry people. Yeah.
It sounds like podcast industry nerds. Yeah, I often hear you talking about, oh, there's this new thing that, nobody knows about yet in terms of how podcasts are going to change the future of podcasting. And you're so up to date on that kind of stuff. So I get that. That's interesting. Thank you for sharing. Welcome, Marie, who just joined us. Mo, if you have any questions, feel to add them to the chat. Marie, just to let you know, you should be able to unmute yourself if you want. You could add written questions to the chat. We started on the topic of guesting on other podcasts, but we've really tried to move into what's serving the audience of this particular instantiation. That's not a word. Episode. This particular event.
Session.
And, session. Yeah. And so we're talking most recently about who's your ideal audience for your podcast, and how are you thinking about them very individually and on a very, intimate basis, and that being the foundation of growing the podcast. So, but we welcome any other questions or comments coming in.
Hey, Elon, I thought as we're approaching the hour, and I do have to drop off right at 3, that I'd go back to, as far as being a guest, reviewing, because I think it's so important. One of the takeaways was to start working on your one sheet and getting ready to do your pitches. I'd like to reiterate at least what I look for and I try to provide when I get an inbound pitch. We talked about that, the whole telling me that you just listened to my latest episode and how much you love it. To me, it comes across as very, cliched now. Everybody does that. So I don't give that much attention. It's more, and I think Rob had talked about this and Margie talked about that, it's, do you communicate that you've studied my show enough to know that, first of all, you're pitching somebody who's going to add value to my show, and you show that by doing so, right? But I'm looking for, briefly get to who this person is, what they're about, what the subject is or subjects that you're proposing that I'm going to talk about on your show. So let me flip it, saying if it's me pitching somebody, what I'm looking for. So I want to know what it is that you want to talk about. I like it when it's a couple of topics or question examples, topics that we might explore. That helps me quickly vet, is this a fit or not for me? And then make it easy through either links or a media page or on the one sheet to share with me where I can listen to you. Either other show appearances, your own podcast, videos, whatever. Those are the things I'm looking for. So don't make it hard for me. Here recently, I don't know if it's a strategy that's evolving. I'm getting pitches where they'll kind of tease it. Oh, I've got this guy, Ethan, and he's into pianos. Would you like to know more about him? I'm not going to respond to that, right? Right. So make it short, but to the point, but give me enough so that I can vet you. And so that's what I try to do when I'm pitching myself onto other shows. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, I'd like to talk about the positioning of a guest when a podcast is pitching a guest to be on their show.
Say that again, Rob.
Well, so let's say I'm an expert at something, right? And I'm well known out there, and a podcast approaches me and wants me to be a guest.
Okay.
On their show, right? What's the responsibility of the guest? So let's say the show is not really ideal, for me, right? As a guest. How can I've faced this a few times. Like I was a guest on a couple of, one interior design podcast, right? They wanted me to be on, right? So it was like, okay, I'll do the podcast, but, as a guest, sometimes you have a responsibility to look at your background and look at your experience base and try translate that into something that is valuable for the show, right?
So did they tell you did they explain why they thought you would be a good guest?
Well, it gets back to what you were just saying earlier too. And it's a little bit, they have a passion for podcasting, right? And they wanted to share to their audience that passion that they have for podcasting. So they wanted to have an episode that would talk about podcasting to help educate their audience in the hopes that maybe some people in the audience would maybe want to start a podcast. So that was their motivation. But when I approached the show about participating, I did like a pre-interview or a pre-call with the host, right? And I just made it really clear to them that how I can position my topic can be more like how to design a podcast, right? So I tried to make it relevant to their show, right? That designing doesn't have to be 100% about how you're going to design your kitchen. Design can be an aspect that can be roped into creating content too. So that's what I tried to bring to the show. So it was, and I think it really worked out well, because then I was really aggressive in my approach to the show around what I can bring to the show that's relevant to the topic of the show.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Aside, I'm reading a book right now called How to Design Your Work Life, which was recommended to me. And it's by a designer. He also wrote a book called How to Design Your Life. So very astute of you to think about things that way.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that if I'm early on in trying to get on shows, I don't know that I would have been that forward thinking as Rob is explaining. Now I will be, but to me, it would just be another opportunity. But you're right. I think it takes us, it's our responsibility to make sure that we do end up adding value, and that sometimes you have to do exactly what Rob described, I think.
Sorry, I was
muted
there for a second.
So
I added a couple of links here. I put in a link to your media page, Henry, just in case people want an example. I think you've done a pretty awesome job there. Sometimes I wonder how you put this stuff together, man. I look at your stuff. It's like
this is because I don't sleep. This is what I do at 1 and 2 a.m. And it's 4 years worth of accumulation of content.
Right. So. That's cool. That's great. And then the resources that we promised to folks who show up, a Dropbox folder with some files in it, some resources to help you with your journey, guesting on other podcasts, some tips on how to find the podcast, some tips once you're on the podcast, before, during, and after, to optimize that experience, an email analysis if you're doing outreach emails, to give you some reflection on how to write some good outreach emails. Let's see here. We had Rob Greenlee gave his about page as well. If you put the HTTPS on,
I
it becomes
didn't
a
put
link,
it on
but
there.
it doesn't in Zoom. Can you believe they haven't gotten that figured out yet?
Yeah, right.
With all the money pouring in. Okay, so but yeah, I think we've got just a couple minutes left. And Deb, I'm happy to stay on for a minute when we're finished, although I know Henry's got to jump off. But I don't know if there's anything else. I mean, we can just wrap it up. I want to tell you guys who next week's guest is. Maybe Rob can give us a little bit of insight. We're having Heather Osgood. She's going to talk about podcast advertising, correct? Any more details on her? Or
well, she's got she has an agency or a representation company that works with a lot of podcasts around typically host read advertising. And so it's called True Native Media is what she is. And she's been doing a lot of online videos on LinkedIn and Facebook and for the last year or so. But she's got a lot of good ideas, and she's been around the advertising side of podcasting for a few years now, and has built up quite a collection of experiences that I think she's going to share with us. Okay, great. And unfortunately, I don't have the sign up link for that, but I will
I will make sure and send out an email to folks who are subscribed to this one, and you can follow our Eventbrite page if you've already subscribed to one of these events, and you'll get some more updates when we release new possibilities. Mo F has something. Sorry, just been listening while driving around running errands. It's been informative. However, thanks for the warm welcome. Okay, great. Mo, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. Okay, great. Well, it's just about 1 minute to the end of the hour. So I'll definitely sign us off of the social platforms. I'll stay on for a minute. I know, Henry, you got to jump off, right? Okay,
Yeah,
so we'll see you later.
Yeah.
And I'll just hang out for 1 minute if anybody has any final questions. All right.
I can probably hang for a minute